To all of you here in Robertson House and the 100-odd online, welcome to the Friday CHACR lecture. It's been a little while since CHACR has looked at NATO. It was 2019 since we produced the areas in Athena. But today we're going to look at NATO. We're going to look at NATO, and it comes up towards its 75th anniversary, a little bit about where it's come from, and that will hopefully inform our understanding of where it's going to. I have a privilege now to introduce Peter Apps. Peter and I were at university together, but clearly he's progressed far better than I have. He's now an award-winning global affairs commentator at Reuters, author, broadcaster, and Army reservist. And his book, which is now titled "Deterring Armageddon: A Biography of NATO," is due out in time for the 75th anniversary next year. Without further ado, Peter, over to you.
Perfect, thank you, Luke. Thanks all for coming down today, both those in the room and beyond. So yeah, as Luke said, I have a sort of not a fictional foul background, both in journalism and also as a reservist over the last on and off over the last 20 years or so. And what I want to talk to today is NATO at 75, and specifically what that means to the British Army. So it's going to be a sort of express elevator ride through NATO's history, how we got where we are, and then going down into the weeds of what that really means, both for the defence of Europe and for NATO as a structure, and also what that means for the militaries within it, and obviously Britain as a fairly major contributor to NATO. Right, if we can hit the next slide. So, sometimes when I give this talk, a lot of people who don't really have much idea what NATO is, but I thought I'd pull out some of the quotes that we've got. So, the world's most successful alliance started styling itself that pretty early. NATO is the world's second oldest alliance. The world's oldest alliance is, anyone got a care for a guess?
Portugal.
Well, not as a formal sort of multinational structure. The League of Delos, which is the league formed by Athens and about 100 to 200 Greek nation states against the Persians several hundred years BC. And that lasted for 74 years. So sometime over the winter, we will get to the point where NATO becomes the oldest alliance in the world. Lord Ismay, Churchill's former military chief of staff, first secretary general, started describing NATO as the world's most successful alliance about 2 or 3 years into its existence, so in the early 50s. And he called it that because he felt that it deterred the third world. A peace project for 1 billion people is how its Assistant Secretary General for Public Relations, Latvia's former Foreign Minister, describes it. The best chance for world peace. That's how Winston Churchill described it when he was trying to persuade Hastings Ismay to take the job. I really like this one, an organised controversy. This is how Harlan Cleveland, who was Nixon's ambassador to NATO, tried to describe it when he was trying to explain to Richard Nixon why it wouldn't be as easy to get NATO to do what Richard Nixon wanted. And what Richard Nixon wanted was what pretty much every US president has wanted, going back to Truman, Eisenhower, and most visibly Donald Trump, which is to get Europeans to spend more in their own defence, including us, and to gradually let the Americans pull back. And one of my favourites, which is Not a Perfect Marriage. Again, that was a US ambassador to the UN in the 1980s. Now, I think that's a bit of an overly simplistic kind of a marriage is just traditionally two people. NATO is essentially a polyamorous commune of 30 plus with nuclear weapons. And that is as complicated as it sounds. Next slide. So let's look at NATO now. This is slightly outdated, as you can probably see, because it doesn't include Finland and it also doesn't include Sweden. But I think it's worth just reminding ourselves, how big NATO now is. With the addition of Finland, NATO, if it was a single country, would now be the largest country that has ever existed. The previous largest country in the world was, answer on postcode? USSR. USSR, exactly. So for the first time with the addition of Finland, NATO takes up more space than the whole USSR did. So it's a really, really big construct. It's more than half the world's defence spending, more than half the world's economy. And as we alluded to earlier, it's about 950 million people. So it would be the third largest country after China and India. So it's a really, really big thing. Next slide. And this is the NATO as was. So this is NATO in the mid-1950s. And so when NATO initially was formed in 1949, it didn't include West Germany, it didn't include Greece, it didn't include Turkey. And they joined over the following 6 years, so between 1952, 3 for Greece and Turkey, and then 1955 for West Germany. So that is a lot, the USSR was a lot bigger, and NATO was a lot smaller. And I think it's worth holding that in your head, because for the Russians, that is not a good 75 years. One of the things that most Russian scholars will tell you, remind you, is that for Catherine the Great, Ivan the Great, you name it, most leaders of Muscovy since about the 15th century, foreign policy has primarily been about having buffer zones against a variety of other people. And the Eastern Bloc from Warsaw Pact was the largest buffer zone that Russia had ever managed to create for itself. And NATO was designed to stop that getting larger. And obviously, when things unraveled in 1989 through to 1991, that disappeared very fast. And for the Russians, that is and remains a really big deal. Next slide. So, where does NATO come from? Well, it comes from the immediate post-war world. And if you look at when people in particularly London started worrying about the Russian threat, you only have to look to May of 1945. So within 2 weeks of Hitler shooting himself in the bunker, Churchill becomes very, very worried. He's writing to Truman. Truman's only been in office for a very short period of time at this point, because Roosevelt's only been dead a very small number of months at this point, 3 or 4 months. To the Soviets and comes back convinced that the Soviet Union is an enormous threat to British democracy and a form of socialism that he liked. So very, very skeptical of elites, very, very skeptical of the officer class, ran the British Home Front industry during the war as Minister of Industry for Churchill, and is made Foreign Secretary by Attlee at the King's recommendation, a bunch of other people's recommendation, specifically to take on both Stalin and Molotov. And Bevin, like Churchill, shares a lot of those worries about the Russians remaining in Europe, the Americans possibly not being that reliable an ally, and the need to tie together Western Europe. And don't forget, in 1945, most of these countries are getting new governments. There were governments in exile in London. So the European continent is completely wrecked. And Bevin starts to tie together a number of arrangements. The first one is the Treaty of Dunkirk with France in 1927, which is a mutual defence act with France, and then the Treaty of Brussels a year later, which ties together Britain, France, and the Benelux countries. And all of that runs in parallel with the creation of NATO. Next slide. What gives that all of added interest? The Berlin airlift and the Berlin blockade. 1948, the Russians closed the supply routes into Berlin. And as the North Atlantic Treaty is being written in Washington by a bunch of State Department officials, the Berlin airlift is underway. The RAF, the French, and primarily the Americans, keeping that city from starving to death in the face of a Soviet blockade. So again, one of the principles about NATO, Donald Rumsfeld in the 1970s, every 10 years it gets a Soviet scare that really saves NATO. NATO is built because all this is going on at the same time. It's really worth holding that thought. There are periods when lots of stuff can be built, and they are your Berlin crises, they are moments of crises like the invasion of Ukraine. Next slide. You won't have heard of either of these two people, but they are the people who built NATO. On the left is Jack Hickerson, State Department head of European Affairs, and on the right is Ted Achilles, his deputy. Again, really worth understanding this process because it speaks to my point. These two, between them, Jack Hickerson has a chat with Ernest Bevin, winter of 1948 in London, and becomes convinced that only a binding alliance with the United States and Europe will stop a third world war. And he, on New Year's Eve 1948, so it's more 47 to 8, so just going 1948, has a chat with Ted Achilles. Goes, we are going to write a treaty. We are going to win the internal fight within the US to bring us into a binding treaty. They do a deal with John Foster Dulles, who's the Republican senator at the time, to deliver the Hill, and they build the North Atlantic Treaty in the space of a year and a half or so, with the buy-in of Truman, Bevin, a whole bunch of other ambassadors from across the alliance, and they write this very, very fast. Next slide. And there we are, North Atlantic Treaty, April 1949, signed in Washington, D.C. For the first time, America is committing to defend things. But, next slide, that is all the North Atlantic Treaty is. It's a treaty. It's really, really loose. It only has, I think, 14 articles, of which quite a lot just keep on mentioning the United Nations Charter. There are 3 or 4 sort of real articles that count, of which obviously most famous are the 5 self-defense clause, which declares that an attack on one is an attack on all. It does not declare that each country goes to war. The reason it doesn't do that is because only the US Senate can declare wars. So it's very deliberately written to be easy to understand, so an Omaha milkman can understand it, to quote Jack Hinkson, but actually not unlike the US Constitution, not unlike Magna Carta. It's very much how you interpret it. One of the things that's quite interesting, and I think potentially of massive relevance in the event of war in Europe, is that when we talk about triggering Article 5, there's nothing in the North Atlantic Treaty about triggering Article 5. After 9/11, there was a decision that we unanimous vote. If you talk to the Eastern Europeans, they will tell you that in their interpretation of it, Article 5 is simply triggered automatically with the invaded. It doesn't have to be agreed by the North Atlantic Council at all. It will just be a self-evident fact. And that's not very surprising. If you think about the people who run a lot of Eastern European countries, they are sort of the sort of quite posh liberals, in fact, like Harvard types, who wrote the US Constitution, close on 250 years ago. Next slide. Really important point. NATO in the treaty has no structure. There is no military structure to it. There's no civilian structure to it. What exists instead of that point is Western Union, the product of the Treaty of Brussels, which is a military organisation run by former Lieutenant Colonel Bernard Montgomery, formerly of this parish, who is the chairman of the military committee of Western Union. And as that Berlin airlift is going on, so 1949, 1950, 1951, he is attempting to build a structure to defend Europe with the Benelux countries, plus France, plus Britain, plus the Americans supporting it. And he does not have a lot of forces for this. He tells London, and London tells Washington, he sends a signal that reads, "My orders are to hold the Rhine. I have the forces to hold the tip of the Brittany Peninsula for 72 hours. Please advance." It's a lot of quite passive aggressive statements. What do the Americans do during the Berlin airlift, beyond the Berlin airlift? They send B-29s to Europe. And that's, again, really, really, this is the European fighting season for the last 75 years. You send big, long-range strategic bombers, and you do big exercises on the European continent. And that cycle, which was the Day Defender 2020, we were in the 1780s with the reforges, that starts in 1949. But the forces are really, really limited. Next slide. In June of 1951, Montgomery sends a signal to everyone he can, and also all the senior commanders, and again makes that same point. We cannot defend Europe. If there is an invasion, it will be chaos. And 10 days later, that's exactly what happens, but it doesn't happen in Europe, it happens on the Korean Peninsula. And everything Montgomery predicts in Europe happens on the Korean Peninsula, including being pushed down to the tip of the peninsula. And that really wakes the US up, and it really wakes the Allies up. The US begins a massive rearmament program. Quite a lot of European countries massively step up their defense preparations. And most importantly, next slide, this guy comes back, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Dean of Columbia University, recently stood down as the Chief of Staff of the US Army, is told by Truman that he needs to come back as Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. And he is appointed just less than 6 months after the pre-war starts. He brings in the same team that planned D-Day. So the modern NATO structures, Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, all of the structures that you guys are probably fairly familiar with, particularly with NATO on a day-to-day basis, that is quite literally built by the same team that planned D-Day in Hammond and in Portsmouth. The same guy who ran Eisenhower's HQ before D-Day is the same person who built SHAPE. Montgomery, of course, is brought back in as CHACR. Again, a similar sort of role to where he sat before. And in the space of a year, they build stuff really fast. And that's important because that is more or less where we are at the moment post-invasion of Ukraine. And so if you look at the Madrid summit, all of these, we need to have a plan to defend Europe overnight. Eisenhower built the first one. We are still operating very much in Eisenhower's world. Next slide. A year after Eisenhower, you get the Lisbon Summit, which builds a much larger NATO. NATO with 100 regular reserve divisions is what they commit to, and never quite gets built. Hastings Ismay, formerly Churchill's military sort of lead staff during the war, formerly military advisor to the Viceroy of India for partition, also ran the Festival of Britain, so he built the South Bank. So he is your Mr. Fix-It. Camel poured some island during the First War, as the adjutant of in India, read lots of Churchill's books and decided to be the real fan just for the First War. He comes in and he builds the civilian elements of what is today. So he does it in Paris. So again, you start building a North Atlantic Council in permanent session. You start building an international secretariat, and you start building the sort of cycle of meetings that we're used to today. Next slide. 1950s. So there's a brief period where we're trying to find a conventional war to defend Europe with a new nuclear bomb. And that period does not last very long. You start to get the hydrogen bomb in the mid-1950s. The first hydrogen bomb is detonated in, I think, 1952 or 3, US hydrogen bomb. And by the end of the decade, the Russians have them, the British have them, you name it. So we move from conventional warfare with a handful of nukes to the world will end. And at the top, you've got John Foster Dulles, Eisenhower Secretary of State, who essentially builds the concept of massive retaliation, i.e., we don't have the conventional ability to defend Europe, so we will go nuclear on a day, not a lot. We also get the Suez Crisis, bottom left. It's the first time we get a really massive division in NATO where different countries believe very, very different things. And we sort of toddle forward through the 1950s with the world getting quite a lot more terrifying each year. Next slide. Charles de Gaulle, quite a disruptive individual, always been quite a disruptive individual. And again, if you're thinking about this from the perspective of, a staff officer in NATO, Montgomery and Eisenhower had a bunch of clashes in the Second World War and when they were at NATO. But I think one of the things that's quite clear is that aside from that stuff that didn't really matter, like whether Montgomery could hold a press conference, the idea of Montgomery not doing what Eisenhower told him, it would have been a complete anathema to him. He knew that Eisenhower was his boss, and he would have followed his boss's instructions in the same way that you would follow the instructions of your monarch. That starts to break down during the invasion of Europe with de Gaulle. So one of the things that Eisenhower bangs on about towards the end of his presidency is a moment during the Battle of Bulge where de Gaulle, commanding Free French forces, suddenly says to him, I'm not going to follow your orders, I'm defending France, and we need to defend, I think, Strasbourg. And therefore, we will just do our thing. And Eisenhower says to him, if that's what you want to do, you will not receive a single round. And we'll win back. And de Gaulle backs down. De Gaulle's the kind of man who holds a bit of a grudge. And he spends quite a lot of time in the political wilderness, 40s to 50s, right, from 1958. He comes back in, it was essentially a coup in France in 1958. And he starts becoming very, very destructive to NATO. And eventually he will kick NATO out of Paris in the 60s. Why is that important? Because we get other individuals like that, Viktor Orban and Recep Tayyip Erdogan in the 21st century. NATO becomes a lot more complicated, and whisper it quietly, the relationships between military commanders and NATO get a lot more complicated. By the time we get to the late 50s, it is no longer a full conclusion that a non-American officer will take the orders of an American officer and follow them through in a time of crisis. And the country that eventually will turn down a CHACR order, most famously, is, of course, the United Kingdom in Pristina Airport in 1999. Next slide. We start getting crisis in the Cold War, building of the Berlin Wall in 1958 through to particularly in 1961 when Kennedy comes in, when Khrushchev starts to really test Kennedy. What do the Americans do? They force a battle group up the Autobahn to prove that they've still got the right of access to Berlin. And they also put tanks checking Charlie. There are, bear in mind, British forces in Berlin, there are French forces in Berlin. They are not involved. Why they're not involved? Because it's too difficult to integrate them. Despite the fact you spent close on a decade building a NATO chain of command, when the chips are down, Kennedy can only move troops fast enough by cutting most of the US Army chain of command out of the way, going directly from the White House to the Pentagon to the US core in Germany to the battle group that they're going to move. NATO gets cut out. Next slide. Cuban Missile Crisis 1962. Cuban Missile Crisis lasts about 13 days, famously, so just under 2 weeks. On what day do you think NATO gets told? The weekend. So for the first week, only people in the White House are aware of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they're shuttling people in like six important people to a limousine so that no one notices, so that no one knows the crisis. NATO finds out at the same time as the press gets briefed, give or take sort of 10 minutes here or there. Even CHACR does not know that there is a crisis going on until midway through. NATO never goes on alert. There's no one can work out whether it's a good idea or not. European countries probably allow it to happen. So NATO is NATO would have found itself at war with the Cuban Missile Crisis, as opposed to it comes, but NATO was not part of the process, with the exception of it being part of the diplomatic battle. So as just before we get the Allies moment in the UN, a bunch of CIA briefers come over and they brief Macmillan, they brief the North Atlantic Council. That happens in every future crisis. So we'll have SS-20 in Europe, the run-up to the invasion of Ukraine. You'll always find American briefers will come out and they will brief the NATO. Again, who was responsible for 9/11. So that really starts a cycle that's quite important to understand. Next slide. After Cuba, neither the Americans nor the Russians have the guts to go back to the brink for almost a quarter of a century. So you get into much more of a pattern of the Cold War. You get detente in between the entire Vietnam through 1975, and then gradually you get the renewed danger of the 1980s, which I won't talk about in great detail. The plot is really interesting. And essentially, the peak point of danger is 1983, where a bunch of NATO exercises, including Reforged 3 and Able Archer, quite famously, quite possibly convinced the Russians that we're on the edge of a nuclear. A whole bunch of things nearly happened in 1983, which are really alarming. Both sides have moments of thinking they're on a ballistic missile attack to the Russians, and is dying. We don't really understand, no one really understands how dangerous 1983 is until several years after George Bush Sr. commissioned a highly classified report that was later declassified. And again, it is now possible to tell how close we came. No one in NATO really understood at the time. The only person in NATO who really understood how dangerous 1983 was the head of intelligence in Brussels, a guy called Renier Rupp, who was West German. Why do you think he knew how worried the Russians were? Because he was working for the Stasi. So he was being phoned by the Stasi, kind of what is going on. We think NATO might be about to launch a preemptive attack, and he goes, "There's nothing going on here. No one knows about it." And at SHAPE, CHACR, who is chairing Able Archer, also doesn't realise it's a more scale until a year. Post 1983, we start to de-escalate. Gorbachev comes in at the end of mid-1984. Obviously, we move towards the fall of Berlin Wall and a very different world. Next slide. For the Berlin Wall, NATO's raison d'etre vanishes quite literally almost overnight. And over the next 2 years, the Soviet Union also unravels. Really important for a number of reasons. Firstly, I'm on the slide for it, but you start, obviously the various countries of Eastern Europe have been rising throughout the 1980s with solidarity in Poland. You get the collapse of East Germany in 1989. The Baltic states realized they have a chance of freedom. And as Yeltsin starts to rise in Russia, Yeltsin is the most powerful politician in the Russian Federation. Gorbachev is the most powerful politician in the Soviet Union. By dissolving the Soviet Union, Yeltsin gets to be king. And as part of that, the Baltic states, which were annexed by the Russians in 1945, essentially, get to be countries again, and they decide they want to be members of NATO. And the other country that gets its freedom during the coup in 1991 is, of course, Ukraine. And you immediately start to move towards a quite messy relationship with Russia and with Ukraine at that point, where Russia, first thing Bush knew, we need the ability to remediate Ukraine's borders. Crimea is really Ukraine, the Donbass is really Ukraine. You start to get this long-running thing that eventually becomes the war. Next slide. So, as I said, the Baltic states, they get their independence in 1991. They're recognized first by Iceland, and then the rest of Europe, and then the United States. And that moves over time. But they play a very long game, a big game back against NATO. They get in 2004. How do they get in? Well, what's going on in 2002-3, when the decision was made to admit them? The Bush administration preparing for the invasion of Iraq. which means that it is much more open to being pressured by Eastern European states, New Europe, to quote Donald Rumsfeld, and that moves the border that we are all obliged to defend to here. Anyone tell me where this is?
Estonia.
Where in Estonia? I'll give you a clue. If it all goes wrong, no, exactly. Worth understanding because this is where, if it all goes wrong, some of us are going to die. Now, this is a long-running fault line. These two castles have faced each other across this river since 1492. The left-hand castle was built by the Danes in the 13th century. So, if you remember Vikings, both the TV show and the real thing, the Viking Empire extends from Canada to the Arctic, to Normandy, to Egbert's Stone, all sorts of plain, which is where Alfred the Great fights them, and wins. It includes London, and this is the eastern flank of it. And so the Danes are replaced by the Teutonic Knights. You have fanatical German Christian crusaders who are sort of a bit Al-Qaeda and a bit SS. And they were very keen to conquer the lands further east, the city-state around modern Russia. And modern Russia, the city-states of Novgorod and Muscovy and so forth, come together against that threat. That castle on the right, which is designed kind of a roadblock, is Ivangrad fortress built by Ivan the Great. Ivan the Great is the first Tsar of Muscovy to declare himself Tsar of Russia. He is, as well as building the castle, he's also turning his attention to Kiev. He's turning his attention to the Khanate, Central Asia. He's trying to build a Russia that will have those buffers. Now, for most of history, Narva is populated by Estonians. The Soviets put a Russian-speaking population in there. That city is the only majority Russian-speaking city in NATO. Hence, it being the most vulnerable point of the front line, and hence it being the place where all of this might go wrong one day. I strongly recommend that you go there if you can. I strongly recommend that you go there. So I've learned one lesson from the Shrine Civil War is that you never, ever into a town for the first time at all. Next slide. Okay. Let's talk about more recent sort of soldiering, the sort of post-Cold War world. From top to bottom, we've got Desert Storm, where the army NATO built, US built to fight the Russians, goes toward the desert. It turns out to be really, really good. Abrams tanks, Apache helicopters, you name it. The Balkan Wars, bottom left to start with, the UN interventions in the 90s. Again, the army NATO built. The fact they weren't NATO interventions doesn't mean that the units doing them weren't only able to talk to the other European units because they've been in NATO. Same true of the Gulf War. And you get the gradual NATOization of the Balkans campaign. So, initially the UN goes in, there's an agreement that NATO will conduct airstrikes and no-fly zone if asked by the UN, essentially as a subcontractor. It takes a while for that to happen. That's going to start happening in 1992. Doesn't happen. They shoot down a couple of server planes in 94. They don't intervene properly until 96. Several points that are important if you're a Brit. We're only able to do the deployment of I-4 because it's commanded by the ARC. The ARC is formerly one British corps. In 1992, that gets re-rolled as a multinational corps that will be able to lead NATO missions. It leads the Bosnia in 96. It leads the Kosovo mission in 99, and it eventually leads ISAF in 2006. So really, really quite important. The first bit of the Baltic wars are they're not that confrontational because we only go after the war's over. In Kosovo, as you know, we have the Pristina Airport standoff, where Mike Jackson, Commander R, Commander K4, refuses the orders of CHACR to seize Pristina Airport from the Russians. Interpreted very differently on both sides of the Atlantic. It is generally interpreted, I would argue, in British military circles as a sign of us being sensible, a sign of us being not stupid enough to start a Third World War. Mike Jackson read about his autobiography. I highly recommend you either watch him talk about it or read his autobiography. But the lead armoured element commander is also referred to say he would have refused a US order to take the airport. And that lead armoured element commander was
James Blunt.
James Blunt. Yeah, what are you? Delightful sort of detailed history. The Americans view that very differently. The Americans view that as a slightly alarming indication that people won't do what CHACR tells them. The reason that the Americans couldn't do what they wanted was they didn't have ground forces. So when Bill Clinton's White House said we want to get the Russians out of Syria, they had no troops to do it. If they hadn't, they would have done what Kennedy did in Berlin. So bear in mind, again, this is really important if you're a Brit, if you're a Brit destined for high command. If the Americans don't send troops, you may be Commander ARC, which means you will be ordered to do stuff by the White House, and we have a national red card, which you will be expected to play. And that is really, really complicated, but it's worth understanding because it gets to the heart of the British military relationship with NATO. Bottom right, 9/11, Article 5 gets declared. That's really important with hindsight because as we get to the 2010s, Donald Trump writes the fact that Article 5 was declared for the United States is really important. Next slide. And of course, it leads to the Afghan war. I am really struck by how professional the British military intervention in Bosnia and Kosovo was. I am also really struck by how that cannot be said about the 16 Brigade ISAF deployment into Helmand in 2006. And that's not necessarily a criticism of any individuals, because if you read the various things that quite a lot of individuals say, it's always someone else's fault. And that's not an unreasonable observation. But Afghanistan is a free-for-all, different countries doing their own thing in their own areas, particularly in the 2006, 7, 8 period. And that is interpreted in various different ways in modern NATO. We still have a lot of goodwill for the level of actual fighting that we were willing to do in Helmand. But there's also some scar tissue. And better people than me can lecture on the Afghan intervention, but it is a very complicated experience for NATO, it's a very complicated experience for Britain, and of course, ultimately it ends in failure in 2021 with the withdrawal from Portugal. So that's really important because, from the perspective of October of 2021, NATO doesn't look in brilliant shape. Next slide. So, as in February of 2022, as 200,000 Russian troops mobilized on the Ukrainian border, and everyone expects Ukraine to fall over in a week or so, NATO looks pretty dodgy. And despite all the effort we put in EFP and otherwise, we talked to Estonians at that particular point, they were pretty impressed. They watched us pull out of the bull in September. They were now watching us extract from Ukraine, and they really, really, really weren't comfortable that we would necessarily do anything different if they were faced by Russia. That has turned around 180 degrees since then, and that is frankly quite a relief for all involved. The invasion of Ukraine gives NATO a new lease of life. NATO was very well prepared for it. Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General, had been in position since 2014. So he had been gradually building up the kind of the stuff in the eastern flank across that entire period. We had the EFPs on the ground, we had air policing on the ground, we had quite a lot of forces moved by that. We had the NATO response force, which was already under Sankey's command with enough troops to do quite a lot of stuff. And you also get American leadership. And all of those things mean that NATO looks a hell of a lot more credible 3 months after the invasion of, or certainly 4 months after the invasion of Ukraine, the day before that. Next slide. Madrid summit, June 2022. In the run-up to this, the Estonians in particular really play hardball. If you look at Prime Minister Kallas, who's somewhere in the middle there, she makes an intervention about 10 days before Madrid, where she basically explains that NATO's defence plans, which are to sort of fight a bit for Estonia and then lose, she does not think credible. Her people will do lots of dying, towns will be destroyed, and she doesn't believe NATO will get the countries back afterwards. The result of that is the Madrid summit, which increases the number of high readiness forces to 300,000 within 6 months, and fires the starting pistol on planning at shape to properly defend Eastern Europe, with really large amounts of forces. And we are currently in the position of building out those plans. So the national defence plans turn into regional defence plans, and a lot of that will then be put back up in Madrid in about 3 or 4 weeks' time. That will get signed up in Madrid. We're basically in that 1951 to 1953 period where we are building. We are already much more able to defend the Baltic states than we were 18 months ago. We will be much more ready again in 18 months' time, and every additional 18 months the Russians don't come, it will be harder for them to come. And that's really important because the Russian military is not currently in a state which can invade Estonia. At some stage, the Russians will stop in Ukraine, they will then retool, and then there'll be a credible threat again. So the Baltics believe we have 3 years at a bare minimum, assuming that the Russians stop tomorrow, or likely probably about 5. Next slide. What are the key lessons that I think we want to take home from this today? Next slide. Firstly, 31 nations in NATO. The Turks, as some of you know, they've got Baltic defence plans, they've got the expansion to Sweden. It is the vital framework, particularly for building structures and culture. There is a fair chance that a big state, which could be Turkey, could be Hungary, whatever, might find a way of popping up and fight. So you might find yourselves fighting in Eastern Europe outside NATO, or within NATO doctrine. And within so essentially, this is why the JEF is really important, which is a base of bunch of Northern European states. Why the CHACR is really important. NATO is essential. The reason that the Russians haven't dared to strike the weapons points of Poland and so forth is because of NATO. It's never really been tested, and it might not properly turn up. Next slide. It actually doesn't matter that much because NATO exists. We can get a bunch of forces already in Eastern Europe, and a bunch more to get. Activity creates effect. Having people there is already good. Being able to get more there is better. And if you look at one of the things that they're not NATO allocated forces, but the fact that we get 16 brigades somewhere really fast is really important. Because assuming that we decided that we were going to offer 16 brigades to NATO on a dark night, or to the defence of Eastern Europe, NATO was going to turn up. We'll talk about CHACR's role in that in a second, so that's really important as well. You need credible, visible force fast. It needs to be there quite credibly already. It needs to be about 3 times larger quite quickly after that. And it needs to be able to fight. It needs to be willing to fight, which is again one of the reasons why paratroopers are really important, but so are tanks, so is fast air, so is counter UAS, so is lots of artillery shells. Next slide. Modern deterrence in Europe is about effect, logistic reach, sustainability, and the ability to leverage technology. There's a lot in there, right? In the Cold War, the Americans maintained 60 days of artillery stockpiles in Europe because they assumed, often coming down to 30 days, because they assumed that a war would not go nuclear after that period of time. We are now in a month, God only knows what of the Ukraine war, and it could go on for another 5 years. That is not the sort of thing we anticipated. You've got to be able to, yes, move kit and people, but you've also just got to be able to keep going in a way that most countries can't. We run out of tank barrels, we run out, you name it, we run out of it. Modern states do not fire as much and have never fired much ammunition since World War II as has been going on in Ukraine. It's a massive deal. And again, also the ability to move big forces transatlantic is already. Next slide. The US, one of the NATO ambassadors told me last week that they felt this was the last classic transatlantic administration. Maybe back in within 18 months. Even if he isn't, we are going to get more we're going to get either isolationist US administration or Asia-focused US administration. CHACR, the assumption would be if the Russians came tonight and NATO didn't step up, you guys would fight and die for CHACR, as would I, right, as a reservist. What if CHACR was ordered not to get involved? Totally plausible scenario. If an American president said, actually no, and I don't want CHACR to be involved. We still have all of the structures. We still have the art, but things like the art suddenly really, and the Brits and the French, and the Brits and the French and the Germans, and the European Union's military structures suddenly quite fast become the only thing standing. Would we be fighting for the EU at that point? We might be. You cannot rely on the Americans being able to, I find desperately underwhelming about the Europeans, and I include the Brits in that, is if you go, well, fair enough, what do you do if the Americans don't turn up? You go, well, we just can't do it. That to me is an unacceptable answer for countries that spend that much on defence. The European Union plus us plus the Norwegians are one of the most credible military forces the world has ever known. Lots of stuff in which we discount the US. We should have back of an envelope plan to defend Europe if the Americans don't turn up, and we don't. And I don't even think that we are morally and emotionally there. And I think we're probably going to have to get there because if nothing else, the shift of focus to Asia will make deliver a need to do that. Yeah, probably an American will be in charge. And we need to work within that. We need to make sure we plug into the American structures, but we need a back of the flag plan to do that if they're not. Next slide. And again, that point earlier, the Ukraine war is a war of conscription, mass levies, huge amounts of use of artillery, more than we've seen in any conflict since Korea. Possibly, if it goes on for maybe the most sustained use of artillery since World War I, might be the most sustained use of artillery ever if it goes on for 5 or 6 years. If you talk to the Poles, they haven't really introduced conscription. They don't really, they are struggling. But the Poles think pretty damn serious about defence. And even they still in their heads around what it means to conscript your entire population. Do you conscript all women? What is the socially conservative government in Poland? What do you want to do? Both my grandmothers were conscripted. Britain is one of the only nations to have ever conscripted women into mass conflict. The only person in all of NATO history who routinely says men and women is former Lieutenant Colonel Bernard Montgomery. Why? Because he had female clerks and nurses under his command throughout most of World War II in no doubt places where they get killed. And for him, it was a no-brainer that, okay, your infantry are all male, but actually when you address a division, a corps, or an HQ, there's a bunch of ATS, and they don't know they're coming home. That's actually really unusual. And the Nazis did it. Well, we don't really. There was Nazi Germany for heritage. The Russians did it. The Russians still do. The Russians have conscription for accountants and medical personnel who are female. So these are really, really big discussions. And would we conscript our population for a long-running war in Poland that lasted 7 years? I don't know. The Germans are thinking about it. The Germans are wanting to conscript the population. This is really, really different to anything we've thought about. And I don't think anyone probably has their heads around it, with the possible exception of B3, who know what the plan is, which is we don't have any people live in a forest for a bit and will attack when everyone else flee. So they have a plan. I think the Poles are still working on it, and to an extent we will need to sort of come into that. The worst case scenario of war in Europe based on the Ukraine war is a multi-year war with mass conscription and a taking use of tactical nukes. Where we now get a city or a war disappears. We do not have anything, again, I don't think we're emotionally, morally, whatever, prepared for that kind of thing. The British Army is too small to be particularly significant. So are most other armies, you'd have to really, really rethink how you do things. And that is where NATO sits at the moment. And that kind of Madrid to Vilnius for the next 20 years is worth it. The last point I'll leave you with, NATO is 75 years old. The next 25 years is probably the most dangerous bit. We are more likely to see a war in Europe that tests NATO in the next 25 years than we have been at any, I would argue, of the previous 75. That's quite alarming. That means we need to up our game. But we got through the last 75, so we'll probably get there get through this. That's me done, so I'm going to take a bunch of questions. But that's my kind of that's where I think we stand at the moment.
To everybody online, thank you ever so much for joining us. Have a good weekend, and please look forward to the next CHACR event. So it's a Friday lecture on Friday the 21st of July, looking at the Israel-Palestine conflict and what we can learn from that. Thank you very much.